So today's question is, why do people with Stockholm Syndrome defend their abusers? It is an interesting question, but in order to answer it, I think we need to first briefly explain what Stockholm Syndrome actually is. And now it gets its name from a bank robbery incident that happened in Stockholm in 1973. And some of those bank employees were held hostage for 6 days. And during that time, they started to become sympathetic to the bank robbers and to their motivations. And when they were all freed and the robbers were brought to trial, some of the bank employees refused to testify against them. And in fact, some of them even raised money to pay for their defense. So a criminologist who was working on the case at the time came up with the term Stockholm Syndrome to describe the affinity that the bank employees showed towards the bank robbers. Now, it isn't a psychological condition. I mean, in terms of you can't diagnose somebody as suffering from Stockholm Syndrome in the same way as you would diagnose depression or other mental health conditions. Stockholm Syndrome is essentially an emotional response to being abused or being held hostage. It describes a coping mechanism for victims, and it describes a phenomenon in which those who are being abused or held captive develop a kind of psychological bond with their captors, often to the point where they come to sympathize with them. Now, it's been identified in many different situations. There's situations, for example, where children are being abused by adults, where athletes are being abused by coaches, where partners are being abused in romantic relationships, and it's even been identified in trafficking cases. Now, the emotional attachment that's formed with abusers might even become so strong that the even when the abuser has been exposed, the victim still proclaims their love for the abuser, and even when the obviously villainous traits of the abuser are pointed out, many victims will immediately defend their abuser before condemning them, even though they themselves are the ones suffering at the hand of that abuse. And victims tend to over-identify with the perpetrator in such a dysfunctional way that they come to see themselves and their abuser as a team, and as a team who are up against all outsiders who are perceived as the enemy. And it can be tremendously challenging to actually help victims truly admit to their perpetrators' true colors and come to terms with the abuse that they've actually suffered because of Stockholm Syndrome. Now, because Stockholm Syndrome is not a psychological condition but a distinct emotional response to trauma, there's no treatment for it. Of course, well, there's no defined treatment for it. Of course, therapy can go a long way to helping victims learn to process the pain of their abuse this will allow them to be liberated from that psychological bondage that comes with Stockholm Syndrome. And, I think it's Stockholm Syndrome, again, is one of these phrases that we throw around without truly understanding the challenges behind it. You'll hear people say, oh, I've been trapped with my teacher all day, I've got Stockholm Syndrome. No, you really don't. Anyway, that's what it is. Don't forget to follow me on YouTube.